Hi biologists, let's start by looking at the learning objectives for this lesson. At the end of this lesson and following the biology syllabus, you should be able to define ecology, ecosystem, biosphere, habitat. You should also be able to define abiotic, biotic and climatic factors and give examples of each in relation to terrestrial and aquatic environments. Define edaphic factors and give examples in relation to terrestrial environments. What does this actually mean? What are we trying to understand? This involves an awful lot of new vocabulary. There's no point in going into these terms until we understand what they mean. However, I would draw your attention to the fact that we have to define these terms. Notice, define ecology, ecosystem, etc. Define abiotic, biotic, etc. Define edaphic factors. This means we have to learn the definitions of these terms and they have to be learned word perfect. Not only do we have to learn the definitions, but we have to give examples of the terms in relation to terrestrial and aquatic environments. What are terrestrial environments? Well, the word terrestrial comes from Latin meaning earth. E.T. was an extraterrestrial. He was from space. Aquatic environments involve water, coming from the word aqueous. Let's battle on. We're going to approach the learning of our ecology definitions or ecology terms like you would approach the learning of a new language. When you learn a new language, you have to learn your vocabulary. When you know your vocabulary, you can put it together and speak the language. The same thing here. When you learn your ecology definitions, you can put them together and then you can speak the language of ecology. It is vital to learn your definitions, therefore, and make sure you understand what they mean. The first definition is the definition of the word ecology itself. What does ecology mean? Well, ecology is the study of the interactions of living organisms with each other and with the environment. Interactions, that means how the living organisms get on with one another. Look at it this way. How do you get on with your classmates in school? Some of you get on very well and help each other. You are interdependent. Some of you are in competition with each other. Some of you depend on others, a bit needy perhaps. And some of you eat each other. So living organisms are the same. Living organisms can be interdependent and help each other. They can depend on each other. They can be in competition with each other and even eat each other. Like yourselves, affected by your environment. If it is too hot in the classroom, if it's too cold in the classroom, if there's no food in the canteen, all of these things in your environment can affect you. If the classroom is overcrowded, perhaps. The living organisms are the same. The temperature of the environment will affect them. Is it too hot? Is it too cold? So in a nutshell, ecology is the study of the interactions of living organisms with each other, how they get on with one another, and how they are affected by their environment. This diagram shows this very nicely. We show the plants and animals are affected by each other. They will have interaction with each other. The plants will also be affected by the environment, and the animals will be affected by the environment. What is an ecosystem? An ecosystem contains a community of organisms which interact with their environment. So basically, when you speak about an ecosystem, you're speaking about a group of animals in a particular place. Ecosystems can be of different sizes. You can have a group of organisms under a stone. That's a very small ecosystem. Usually though, we use the word ecosystem to refer to large areas. Basically, you have a group of organisms like the monkey, the tiger, the elephant, interacting with each other and interacting with the environment, and that ecosystem is the rainforest. You can have a group of organisms like the shark, the jellyfish, the crab, the seaweed interacting with each other and interacting with the seawater, forming an ecosystem known as a marine ecosystem. Same thing with the cactus, the snake and the scorpion. They're interacting with each other, interacting with the environment, forming a large ecosystem called a desert. What is the biosphere? Now, if we look closely here, we can see the word bio and we can see the word sphere. Bio means biology, sphere is a roundy thing. So the biosphere is that part of the earth, the roundy thing, and its atmosphere in which life can exist. So if we keep this in mind, this will help us to distinguish between our different definitions. Now, when we think about the biosphere, where life can exist, that's going to have to include the soil, the air, or the atmosphere, or the waters, because life can exist in these three places. S-A-W. You saw the biosphere. When you think about it, the Earth is a global ecosystem. Many smaller ecosystems. It's rather like the universal set in maths, made up of elements. No part of the biosphere is completely isolated from the rest. There's always exchange of organisms, nutrients, energy, and other materials between ecosystems. If we look here, this diagram represents it very well. We have the biosphere, or the global ecosystem, and within that you can have the rainforest as a subset, freshwater ecosystem as a subset, the marine ecosystem as a subset, the desert as a subset. Now, as we have just said, no part of this biosphere is completely isolated. It's very clear to see that the freshwater ecosystem of the river will have an interaction and exchange materials with the marine ecosystem because the fresh water flows out to the sea. Bit more difficult to see how the rainforest relates to the desert and that there's an exchange of materials here, but we'll conveniently ignore that. What is a habitat? A habitat is a place where an organism lives. There used to be shops called Habitat. Enough, they used to sell things for your house. What is a population? A population is a group of organisms. Now we need to be very careful here, of the same species living area. So you might have a population of rabbits living in the field. This would be a group of rabbits. They're all of the same species. They're living in the area called the field. So a population is a group of organisms of the same species. Now a community is made up of all the different populations that share the resources in an area. So for example, you could have a population of rabbits in the field, as we've just said, sharing the grass in that field with a population of cows. So that makes up a community in the field. A community is made up of all the different populations, the rabbits and the cows, and they're sharing the resources in that field. Here's a picture of a common community. First of all, we have a habitat, a place where plants and animals live. Habitat might be up in the tree, called the field, and there might be a habitat which is up in the mountains. These habitats are populated by populations of organisms. Here we have a population of squirrels. A population consists of organisms of all the same species living up in the tree. There's a population of rabbits living in the field. We must also realise that populations can be made up of plants. So there's also a population of ash trees living in the field, accompanied by a population of foxes. Bad news for those rabbits. Now, all the populations or the communities can be affected by things in the environment. In other words, they can be affected by environmental factors. The first set of factors are biotic factors. Abiotic factors are non-living factors in the environment that can affect an organism. The first abiotic factor that can affect organisms, as we know ourselves, are climatic factors. These are things related to the temperature, to the light intensity. Edaphic factors are always factors or things related to the soil. They might be as simple as the pH of the soil, the moisture content of the soil. These things, the climate and the edaphic factors, are going to affect the life of an organism. Biotic factors are factors that are related to living things. Are there living things in the environment that might affect the organisms? Well, the first thing that might affect you is competition, either between yourself and another member of the same species, or between yourself and a member of another species. Parasitism often affects organisms. Feeding on each other, causing harm. Predation, getting eaten, would affect living organisms. Symbiosis is a term where we live with one another and we both benefit from the relationship. And humans are another living factor in the environment that can affect the life of organisms. Biotic factors can be grouped together and in general refer to the living organisms that might affect you when you are living in your habitat. So, in a nutshell, biotic factors in a terrestrial environment boil down to two main types: the climatic factors and the edaphic factors. The climatic factors are basically talking about weather, and the edaphic factors are things to do with the soil. When we look at the list of climatic factors, we can see we have light intensity, we have temperature, humidity, rainfall, and day length. Light intensity, we are particularly interested in this because we're going to be measuring light intensity in our practical work. We will measure light intensity with a light meter. Light intensity has an effect on the organisms in the environment. For example, some plants are shade-loving plants and will prefer to live in the shade, and other plants are sun-loving plants and will prefer to live in the sun. We are also going to be particularly interested in temperature. We will need to take the temperature of the atmosphere with an air thermometer, and we will need to take the temperature of the soil with a soil thermometer. Temperature affects the growth of plants. We all know that the growth of grass slows down during the winter. This is why we don't need to mow our lawn. Humidity refers to the percentage water in the atmosphere. Rainfall is the amount of rain, very relevant this season, and the length of the day. These all affect the organisms in a terrestrial environment, but the two main ones that we will need to remember and focus on are light intensity and temperature. When we look at the list of edaphic factors, we can see that we have soil pH, which refers to the acidity of the soil, how acid it is. Soil pH is very relevant because it affects the life of organisms in the soil. For example, earthworms do not like to live in acidic soil. The other edaphic factors are soil type. It might be clay, it might have a lot of humus, It might be a sandy soil. The type of soil can affect the organisms living in it. Soil moisture, the amount of water in the soil, that can also have an effect on the living organisms, and the mineral content or the fertility of the soil. We will be focusing our attention on measuring soil pH in our practical work, and we will measure soil pH with a pH probe. Now, these are the factors that pertain to a terrestrial environment, a land environment. What about the factors that pertain or that influence aquatic environments? Well, if we are talking about aquatic environments, for example, like the river, then water current can affect the organisms in a river. Some organisms like to live in fast-flowing water. Other organisms will like a slow-moving stream. Light penetration. How deep down does the light go? For example, the Titanic is in pitch black. The light does not penetrate down that far. Wave action. The organisms living on rocks at the seashore might be affected by wave action if they're strong, if the waves are gentle. Dissolved oxygen, the amount of oxygen dissolved in the water, this is going to affect the fish life. For example, in a fish tank, if there isn't much oxygen in the water, then the fish in the fish tank will be sluggish. Salt content is another important consideration. The salt content of some environments, some aquatic environments, can affect the organisms living there. For example, our friend the crocodile, or it might be the alligator here, can be affected by the salt content in the water. Some prefer to live in freshwater habitats and others prefer saltwater habitats. The pH of the water, the acidity of the water, is another important consideration, and exposure refers to the fact that when the tide goes out, that organisms are left exposed on shore. If organisms are left exposed for too long a period of time, like seaweed, there is the danger of the seaweed drying out. Here we have 7 factors that affect aquatic environments. You would not necessarily be expected to remember all 7 factors, but you should remember 3 and have 3 in your back pocket to fall back on. I would suggest boring is best. I would run with water pH. I would run with dissolved oxygen because you might come across that in chemistry. And I would run with the salt content because these are rather obvious factors. Now, what are the biotic factors? As a reminder, biotic factors are living things that affect an ecosystem. So biotic factors usually refer to the relationships that you might have with other organisms. You might notice the word bio. Biotic to the relationships between organisms, and as a result of these relationships can then have an effect on the size of a population. The biotic factors in a terrestrial environment would be competition. For example, getting back to our population of rabbits and our population of cows in the same field, they're both competing for resources that might be in short supply. So there's competition for the grass, for example. Then there is predation. Getting back to our poor rabbits, they are going to be preyed upon by the foxes. Parasitism, meaning that perhaps these rabbits have fleas and this is going to affect them and perhaps cause them harm. Symbiosis is a relationship where 2 organisms are living in close vicinity, have a close relationship, and they both benefit. And human activity is also another very important biotic factor that can affect life in a terrestrial environment. So for example, if Joe Soap decides to go out with the shotgun or to spread poison, then that's going to affect the population of poor rabbits. So in a nutshell, we have the environmental factors summary. Environmental factors can be divided into two types. The two types are abiotic factors and biotic factors. The abiotic factors are referring to the non-living factors, the life of organisms, and they can be divided into two. We have the climatic factors and we have the edaphic factors, which relate to the soil, and these pertain to a terrestrial environment. And also, don't forget, aquatic environments are special, so you have your list that will pertain to the aquatic environment. The biotic factors are the living factors that affect organisms in a habitat, and these living factors usually relate to relationships with other organisms, either of your own species or different species. So we'd have competition, parasitism, predation, symbiosis, and humans. Later on, we will look at each one of these in more detail. Now we've reached the end of the lesson. You should be able to define ecology, ecosystem, biosphere, and habitat. You should also be able to define abiotic, biotic, and climatic factors, and be able to give examples of each in relation to terrestrial and aquatic environments. Can you define edaphic factors and give examples in relation to terrestrial environments?